All right. Hello, everybody. Great to see you. Thanks for coming and hanging out with us. Well, I guess we've got a question with Sean. Hello, Sean. Sean says, can you explain what tendency tones are in the relationship to jazz studies? Tendency tones this is not just jazz, by the way. Tendency tones are when you take the notes from one chord in a sequence and look at how they want to go to the next chord in the sequence. So the reason I teach tendency tone etudes is because when you learn the tendency tones, and they really should, I know I don't make everybody do this, but they really should be by memory. And we want to take the notes in the previous chord, and we write these out. You take the notes in the previous chord and go to the next chord. And generally speaking, it's not always this way, but generally speaking, we start with the seventh going to the third. This comes from the cycle of fifths, right? We want the cycle of fifths to be fresh in our head. That's why we do these exercises. And when we have chord progressions that go through the cycle of fifths, a great example of that is a 2-5-1. 2 to 5 to 1 is going through the circle of fifths. The 7 in the 2 wants to go to the third of the 5. The 7 in the 5 wants to go to the third of the 1. If we continue that, like it is in Autumn Leaves, for example, the progression is 2, 5, 1, 4, 7. Now that 7 is now the 2 chord in minor, but we're not going to go there yet. 7, 3 to 6. Now the 6 is the minor. The whole progression in let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 chords. You're hitting the 7 notes in the C major scale. D, G, C, F, B, E, and A. 7 chords, 7 notes of the major scale. That's an example of a song that follows the cycle of fourths. Some people say cycle of fifths, cycle of fourths. If you're going up, it's fourths. If you're going down, it's fifths. It's the same thing. And I'm going to say this one more time. The 7th of the previous chord, so in D minor, the 7th of D minor is C. The C wants to go to the B. So when we write tendency tone etudes, we start with a third. So in the D minor, it's F, and then we play C. Then we play B, which is the third of the next chord. And then we play F, which is the 7th, which goes to the E, which is the third of the next chord. By learning the tendency tones, you are learning the chord progressions without having to do the traditional educational arpeggiating that they teach. I'm not 100% against those arpeggios. They work to a degree, but they are not musical, and tendency tones are musical. Hello, Gabrielle. Nice to see you. I want to share with you what other people teach. I grew up on this. It is valuable to a degree. It's valuable in that it mentally helps you learn what the chords are, what the notes are in the chord for the song. So since we were talking about autumn leaves, let's do autumn leaves. This is the traditional way of teaching how to improvise on autumn leaves. You start with just the roots. And if I was going to have you do that, which I'm not going to, but I want to demonstrate what the difference is between this approach and the Tennessee tone approach. If I was going to have you do that, I would make you do it 10 times by memory, just the roots. Then we do quarter notes. Other people do half notes. I'd rather do quarter notes. Now, some people do on that last chord, they do a dominant seventh. I'm not going to do that here. Then they would do, if once again, that's 10 times doing that by memory for the whole song, not just the first 8 bars. Then the way I like to do it is you do backwards. And this is very important actually because you don't get the full benefit of doing this exercise if you don't go backwards. So we're going to now do third root, third root. All right, then we do root, third, fifth. Each one of these is 10 times by memory. Then we go backwards. Remember, we want to go backwards. Okay. Then we want to do the sevenths. Root, third, 7 on each one of the chords. Oh, I'm sorry. Then we want to do that backwards, right? Descending instead of ascending. Let me see. Then the next step is to do the scales. I'm not going to take you through the whole thing, but it's the same pattern, right? And we would do that going descending as well. That sequence that I just went through is traditionally called the practice patterns. And if any of my students are watching this right now, they might be asking themselves, why did I not teach them this exercise? Because I don't teach this exercise. This is what I grew up on. You know, I had frustrations when I was learning how to play jazz when I was younger. I did everything they taught me to. I played everything in every key. I did the practice patterns. I submerged myself in all of the stuff that they taught. And after 9 years of that, I still couldn't play a halfway decent improvised solo. I struggled so much to play a halfway decent improvised solo. That's why I left those traditional things. For example, now I don't, I still do at this point, I still do where you play the lick in every key, but I only do that once as an introduction to that lick. If I find a new lick that I like from somebody that I'm listening to, I will do that lick as an introduction to acclimate my mind to that lick. I will run it through every key, but I use that only as an introduction to that lick. After that, I incorporate it into my system that breaks the lick down into its components. And then I practice those components, all of the components from every lick that I've learned in one key. That's the tonalization one. That's the tonalization method. When we talk about the tonalization scales, the scales came out of the method. So, as a summary, I have turned my back on the traditional jazz education. And Wynton Marsalis even came out in the 80s denouncing that jazz education style. I remember it very well. So getting back to the tonalization, now the tendency tone studies. The tendency tone the tendency tone studies replace the practice patterns, and you could say, well, if you do that, you're not getting the full benefit of the practice patterns. That's right. So here's what the tendency tones would sound like on that song. Do you get with that all of the technique that you get from the arpeggios that they do in that other study, the traditional study? No, you don't. I would much rather have the ear without the technique than to have the technique without the ear. And that's what happens with with the traditional practice patterns is you get the technique, but you don't get this. Now, there's ways to practice the tendency tones to where you get more of that in there. And that's what we have the tendency tone one, the tendency tone two, and now I've actually broken that up so that it's one, two, three, and four. And three and four are going to have more of the other notes. When you practice that and memorize it and can play it by memory, you will be playing the chords. So what does it matter if you can tell somebody that's what the chord is? Now, we do want to learn the chords. I'm not saying this is a shortcut. This is just a better way to learn. We do work on the technique. We just don't do it that way. And if you're not practicing your arpeggios, you're not getting the technique. If you're not practicing the tonalization studies, you're not getting the technique. But the tendency tone studies give you the harmonic framework in a way that your ear can pick it up better. Hello, Free. Free says, hi, Eddie. Are you going to record any new albums this year? I have some ideas. I would like to do a trumpet and bass duo. We might make an album, maybe not. But that's as far as recording goes this year, my hope is to make a recording with a bass player, just me and the bass player improvising, playing tunes. So that's my hope. And the reason I can't say for sure that we're going to make an album is I don't know. I haven't made any albums yet with two people here in my studio, right in this room. I've made recordings with other people, but I paid for the studio. My idea now is to have someone come to the house and record with me here. So that's what's on the back of my mind right now. So yes, I'm hoping that is this year. Gabriel says, Eddie, when I practice lip slurs on Chops Pro, where should I hold my tongue on the high notes? As low as I can, or do I take it up? There's no answer to that. You have to find what works best for you. Not everybody. I got a comment this week. Let me find that comment. Oh, here's my comments. All right. Someone said, oh, I clicked the wrong button. Someone said, I like your videos, but there are people who do not move their tongue at all? Question mark. They're playing just between, they are playing, that's the wrong word. They are playing just between an octave or what? And this person is assuming that everybody does the tongue arch for higher notes. And that's not true. And nobody can tell you what's best for you. That's one of the areas where I differ from some of the other teachers out there. Like I know Claude Gordon? One of the books talks so much about using the tongue arch to get the higher notes. And here's the thing. We don't want to ever disregard the background of some of those things. Some of the people who teach the heavy tongue arch like that are people who had, and I'm thinking of one person in particular, and because his one zealot student that is still alive right now, I think he's still alive, hates it when I talk about him. I'm not going to mention the guy's name. But this dude was walking across the street when the street was iced. And he slipped on the ice and he came down, and you know those bumps that they put in the road so that you don't go over the side or whatever? He basically hit his face on that bump when he fell on the ice. All of his teeth were gone. His lips were shredded. He had to relearn how to play. Yeah, I'm not saying his name. He had to relearn to play. His lips were shredded. Fortunately, there's not just one way to play the trumpet. He had to put the arch. This is my theory. He had to use the arch because his lips were shredded. So he doesn't have the subtle control inside here that we have because our lips didn't get shredded. Praise God that there's an alternative. We should be thankful that there's more than one way to play the instrument. But because there is more than one way to play the instrument, there's no one right way to tell people. So if you ask me, should my tongue be going up or should my tongue stay down? That depends on what kind of player you are. I think most people use the tongue arch. Most people today probably use tongue arch. From what I heard Jim Thompson say in a master class, my assumption is he does not use the tongue arch. He does not move anything in the face. And everything that he does to change notes and get it, all of that is just the air. He only changes the air. He does not use tongue arch. I'm sure that he uses a little bit of control in the lips. I can't imagine that somebody would not do that. But he probably uses a lot less control in the lips because of the way he uses his air. And I have heard other musicians, other trumpet players in master classes, I have heard others say very specifically that it's all about the air. And you have to wonder if that's not what they're saying. I haven't been able to categorize them and classify them as individuals into different sections. But that's my understanding is that there actually are people who do not move their tongue to play. This entire process for everybody is trial and error. The teacher cannot help you with that. The teacher can't tell you, do this with your lip, do this with your tongue, do this with your jaw. Teacher can't tell you that. You have to discover those things on your own. Where the teacher comes in is helping guide you through that process. Maybe there's aspects of this that you're not aware of. Maybe, this happened to me. I didn't know that we were supposed to move. Not. I shouldn't say supposed to. I didn't know it was okay to move your jaw up and down. I thought it was supposed to be down and stay down. It wasn't even on my radar. So when I started moving my jaw for the different registers, I was instantly a better player. Not because people need to use their jaw. Like I said, some people don't do that. Or some people will do less of it. But when I saw that as an option, where I didn't see that before, it opened doors for me. It's quite possible that I could have been introduced to that, the jaw movement, and decided, no, that's not right for me. When it comes to stuff like tongue position, lip tension, people talk about the firmness of the corners and all that stuff. That's all individual. It's all unique to each individual. And it's 100% trial and error. We cannot have someone dictate to us how that works. And I will not, I refuse to be the guy that says you should do this, you should do that. You'll notice in my books, there's very, very little of that in my books. My books are about the procedure. And let's talk about that a little bit. When I developed the physical trumpet pyramid and the one range approach. It was because I was cut off from all the teachers that could help me. I'm not putting down the teachers I had at that time. They just couldn't help me. The problems I was dealing with, they were not uh, prepared to work with me on that. The one teacher told me, "It looks fine. Don't worry about it." It wasn't fine. Looking fine is not good enough. So that's what I'm saying. He was unable to help, and I was cut off. So when I developed my method back in the 80s, it was with the idea. Now, I also believe that this is divine because it ended up being better than I expected. There are so many benefits from this method that I didn't plan on. So I feel like that wasn't 100% my cleverness. I mean, I was in my 20s when I developed this method, and it's still working today. I tweak it. But anyway, what I was trying to say is I knew I didn't have help. I knew I was ignorant. I knew I didn't have the information that I needed. So what did I do to create this method? I created a method that based on the fact that I didn't know what I was doing. And that method was meant to force me into situations that would force me to figure it out. That's what my method is. And that's why I talk all the time about familiarity, because familiarity is the result of that. You you get those slurs every day. You get those articulation studies every day, and it puts you in this environment. By doing it every day and becoming more and more familiar with those challenges, the mind naturally works out the problem. Now let's talk about tongue arch in that context. In the context of me developing my method, I developed the method first. I didn't know anything about tongue arch. Remember, I was cut off. I had no teachers that knew anything about this stuff. I lived in a city. This is back when long distance cost so much. For me to have an hour long phone call, it would be over $100, which back then was a lot of money. I was cut off. And I took what little I knew about the trumpet and created these exercises, and I made myself do this. When I learned about tongue arch, I realized I was already doing that. Nobody told me to do it, but I raised my tongue in my mouth because of the routine every day, hitting that routine, going to those notes, playing those notes in so many different contexts, the long tones, the scales, the lip slurs. It forced me to figure out on a purely subconscious level where my tongue needed to be. And that's how the method was developed. And that's why today I don't have to make sure that the students understand how the method works. It just works. And that's why it just works, is because that's how it was designed. It was designed in my ignorance to force me to mentally figure it out. Each one of us has a different combination, a different mixture of air pressure and different sources of resistance. We each have our own unique combination, and part of the purpose of the Routines is to help you discover that natural combination, that unique combination of resistances and air pressure, unique to you, that creates your sound and gives you the flexibility and control that you need. That's what the method is for. So when I say the method, what am I talking about? The one range book, the physical trumpet pyramid book, and then all of the routine books, the daily routines, the Chops Express, and then now each one of the Chops books that are coming out. All of those are designed on the same principle that I created when I was still ignorant. And that principle still works. That's why I still sell those books. If it didn't work, I wouldn't sell them. Free says, I think the use of the tongue is something that connects our playing with singing. That's the reason why it's a more natural approach than other methods. There's a lot of truth in that. I remember we used to have Francis Orville at our university. Francis Orville, for those who don't know who he is a very famous French horn player. Uh, and he showed me a study that he did with some other brass players. And what they were studying is how similar is playing a brass instrument to speaking. And what they discovered is that the vocal cords actually vibrate while we're playing. And I think there's a connection between that and what you're saying. Yes, we do bring an element of our own character into the music with the way we use our tongue. And I have said in other videos that the style, the style of our performance is dictated by the tongue. What happens in our style is what happens in our mouth with our tongue. So there's a lot of truth there. But I think what Gabrielle is getting to is not necessarily I think it's distinct from what you're talking about. When we talk about using the high notes, using the tongue arch during the high notes, it's an exaggerated movement. And not everybody does that. Not everybody does an exaggerated movement of the tongue as the high notes go higher. Now, I do want to clarify this. The tongue does not make the note higher. You don't use the tongue to make the note go higher. The way I see it is that the tongue supports the airstream. If the airstream is this big going through your mouth, then we want the tongue to at least come up to where that is. Otherwise, there's like turbulence. This is my perception of how this works based on what I'm feeling in my mouth. And we know that that's not reliable. So take this with a grain of salt. What it feels like to me is that the tongue is coming up just to where you can feel the air running over the top of it. That's how I do this. I only go and so when I go to a higher note, if I don't move the tongue up higher, I don't feel that feeling. I don't feel the air going over the tongue, and that gives me a different sound on those notes. It's not as clear, it's not as vibrant. So I try to bring the tongue up high enough that I can just barely feel the air brushing over the top of it. And by the way, the tongue, see how I'm holding it in my hands like this? The tongue, I put my tongue in a U shape like that inside my mouth so that the air is more focused. And the higher I go up into the upper register, the more I the more I shrink that U shape in my tongue to a smaller size. When I'm playing up in the high C, not high C, super C area, that hole that the tongue makes between the roof of my mouth and the tongue is so small, my pinky finger wouldn't go in there. I've tried. I'm not going to demonstrate that. Yeah. But yes, I've tried. It's the whole the oral cavity. Let's call it the oral cavity. The oral cavity is so narrow for the super C that my pinky finger would not fit. Great, great topics. What else do we have? I don't know if you guys can tell, but I'm really, really trying not to say okay, okay, you know, because I've been editing some of these live streams and there's so much of that in there. It takes me so long to edit it because I have to take all of that stuff out. So I should also stop saying so. I'm really working on not saying any of that filler stuff. Gabriel says, on the scale expansion studies book that I use a lot, there are no minor scales. Are they less important? No, they're not less important. And eventually I will do a similar book with the minor scales. You don't necessarily need the book to do that. You can do that on your own. But no, they're not less important. What happens? Have I told you guys about the trumpet music publishing pyramid? So we have at the very top your virtuosos, and then you have at the very bottom the beginners. And the beginners have things that they have to play. That's the stuff where you're going to make your most money. And I do take that kind of stuff into account because I have to make a living. So I balance the stuff that's going to sell with the stuff that's more important. And because so many people need the major scales, that's what we spend the most effort on, is creating the major scale exercises. But you're right, the minor stuff is, I won't say equally important. So maybe the answer to your question is yes, they're less important, but only this much. The major scales are the parents of the minor scales. So in that sense, they are more important than the minor scales. But in the sense of whether or not we should learn them, no, they're not less important. Where do we start getting less important? We can say, for example, that the pentatonic scales are less important. The chromatic scale is not less important. The chromatic scale is vitally necessary. If you're not practicing the chromatic scale, you should be doing that. What else? The whole tone scale is less important. The diminished scale, less important. Gabriel says, I usually play the major and the relative minor just after the major is it correct? You can do it that way. I've done it that way before. In fact, I'm going to tell you, I just restructured my scale practice, and I'm going through all of the scales vertically down the page in a way that they all correspond to the same key, which is basically the same thing as what you're saying. So I have 60 major scale patterns that I do over the tonalization studies. Then I have 20 pentatonics. I have 20 minor, and that would be the harmonic minor. I have 20 melodic minor, and then I'll do the chromatic scale based on that same starting note. I'll do the whole tone scale based on that tiny starting note. But what I'm trying to do is play them all sequentially so that they're related to each other, which is basically what you're talking about. So I think there's actual benefit to doing that. So, it's not about that's Vladdy. And I know when I called her Vladdy, it's because when she was a kitten, she looked like a bat. And I asked Pearl what German was for bat, and she said Fledermaus, which I guess I knew that because of the opera, and had just forgotten that. And Fledermaus, I didn't want to call her right out Fledermaus, right? Um, but I thought, hey, that's real close to Vladimir. So I called her Vladdy because at that point we didn't know if they were male or female. So I called her Vladdy, which I know is probably a boy's name, but that's what we call her, Vladdy, for short for Vladimir, and which kind of sounds like Fledermaus. I guess it really doesn't sound like Fledermaus, but yeah, she looked like a bat when she was just a little kitten. We have 4 cats. And what's interesting, because they're ferals. Well, they're not feral anymore, but their parents were ferals, and then they come from a long line of feral cats. And what's interesting, they all have different colors. So we have a black one, a gray one, and one that's like tiger stripes with orangish, and then one that's got the stripes without the orange. All right, any other questions? I'm not really a cat person. They found us. The mother of these cats was a feral cat, and when the door was open, she brought them into the house as kittens. No, that's fine, Gabriel. Gabriel says I have one, but maybe it's long and we have no time. That's fine. Go ahead and ask. That's what we're here for. Oh, by the way, hi, Karen. I'm sorry I didn't say hi, Karen. By the way, the reason I didn't say hi, let me explain this, is because I'm trying to not interrupt what I'm saying. I have a very bad habit of interrupting myself when I'm on these things, and I wasn't as aware of it until I started editing it to make those clips. Oh, it takes so much time because I'll stop in the middle of what I'm saying and say, "Hey, how are you doing?" And that's nice, but it's making a lot more work for me. Gabriel says, I always heard talking about accuracy What is meant by that? So if you know about machining, this is something I learned from my brother because my brother worked with Schlumberger, which is it's a oil supply company. They make pipes and stuff like that. And what I learned from him is that the the tolerances between the part that you're making and the part that it's supposed to go with, there's no such thing as zero tolerance. You have to have a tolerance amount. And when we have the computerized stuff, they can make tolerances that are so tight that they're practically zero. We can think of accuracy in those same terms. We can think of accuracy in terms of how accurate we are. Okay, here I am defining the word with the word. Let's talk about what the broad term of accuracy would be if we're going to be inaccurate at a broad level. I go for an E and a G comes out, that's not accurate, is it? No, it's not accurate. If I go to the E and it starts off with a kind of crackly sound, I'm going to try to imitate this. I'm not very good at that kind of thing. Okay, that was inaccurate because I didn't have that solid start at the beginning of the note. So we can also have things like this, where it starts off at one note and goes to the note that you're trying to get to. All of these things are considered inaccuracy. Now, if you have just an uncentered note, that's when we're talking about the shrinking tolerances, an uncentered note for a very advanced player is inaccurate. Hear how that was out of center? It had like a little growly sound at the beginning of it on the C, not the G. The C had a growly noise at the beginning. That was uncentered. And the uncentered note is just a higher level of inaccuracy. When we're playing accurately, we hit the center of the note every single time, no matter what. That's what most of us mean by accurate. Another more slang way to say it is when you're playing accurately, you're not cracking notes. We can say it that way. So, Gabriel says that's impossible in classical music. In classical music, we strive for absolute accuracy. That doesn't necessarily mean that the accuracy is always there. I remember listening to an album, and because it's going to be sounding like I'm saying something bad about him, I will not mention who the artist was, but it was an album with him playing a lot of solo stuff. And when I first heard it, I was just blown away with how amazing it sounded. After 2, 3, 4 years of listening to that album over and over and over again, I started hearing some of the middle notes and that they were not centered. Can't fault the guy because it was amazingly difficult stuff he was playing. I'm not saying this as an insult to him. When you're playing stuff, right, stuff real technical like that, if some of the notes in the middle of that double tongue section are not nearly as centered as the other stuff, I'm not saying I can do a better job, But it was amazing to me that in the beginning I couldn't hear that. When I first started listening, even for a whole year listening to that album, I could not hear those uncentered notes. You know that old saying, familiarity breeds contempt. You listen to an album over and over again, a lot like that, you're going to start picking stuff up, little details like that. You're going to start hearing the flaws. Nobody plays flawlessly. So in classical music, you're right, that's what we strive for. In jazz, we don't necessarily strive for that. But it's not, just like what we can't have in machining, you can't have zero tolerance. It's not possible. It's the same thing with music. That's not possible to have 100% accuracy. That's not a thing. The deeper you get into it, the deeper you find that there's still stuff you can fix. It just isn't as obvious. And that's the point I made with that guy's music. It's just not as obvious. And that's why I mentioned the thing about the tolerances. Let me go back to Free real quick. Free says, what do you think about D? Oh, Donald Reinhardt and his methodology, the pivot embouchure classification, wet lips instead of dry. A lot of what I teach and what I do is very similar to what he taught. I don't necessarily catalog embouchure types the way he did. And I think the reason I don't is because my method of teaching is already flexible. I don't have to make it methodic. There's already a give and play in the way that I teach. So that and by the way, that's why he categorized people that way, was because if you were this kind of player, then he would give you certain exercises different from this kind of player. I actually have some friends that were students of his, and I've had the opportunity to talk to them about the way he taught and how that relates to his book. I think the book is awesome. I don't have it. I would love to have it, but I don't. I read it. My third trip to Montreux, I played in the Montreux Jazz Festival 3 times. Actually, technically, the first time was not in the festival. It was down the street from the festival. But yes, I've been to Montreux performing 3 times, and the third time, one of the trombone players had the Reinhardt book, and he lent it to me during the trip, and I read the whole thing during the trip. So that's where my knowledge of his book comes from, and then my knowledge of his method comes from the people I've spoken with, either in person or online. Oh, my eye is starting to itch. All right, so Gabriel says, so how do I work on accuracy, ear training, and familiarity as usual? So the purpose of the tonalization studies is to help with that. Also, the lip slurs in my book, that's what they're for. And yes, it's familiarity. The more familiar you are, not just with the note, but the context that the note is in. It's not just being familiar with the individual note, because it's like, I remember talking to my brothers and I said, I don't understand the whole free throw thing in basketball. It didn't make sense to me. If it's always the same position and always going to the same distance, the same height, Why is it that these guys miss so often? And my brothers had the best answer. It was an amazing answer. They said it's not the distance to the hoop that changes, it's the player that changes. When you have different levels of fatigue and excitement and the stuff that happens, the dynamics of the game itself change you as a person, and it becomes more difficult the way it feels to get it into the hoop. And it's the same thing with what we're talking about here. You can't just say, okay, there's the note. That note has to have a context, just like the the free throw in the context of the game. The free throw has a context because certain things happen leading up to that free throw. For all we know, the reason you had that free throw is because maybe there was a foul against you and maybe you're feeling kind of beat up and bruised right now. That's going to definitely change the way you feel trying to get that ball into the hoop. It's the same thing with familiarity on the individual notes. Familiarity with individual notes is not enough. It has to have a context, and that's where the routines come in. The context that we're getting from those routines, we're hitting those notes, all of the different notes, whether it's high, whether it's low, it's in the middle of the staff, doesn't matter. We're hitting them all from different directions with different contexts. We're tonguing, we're not tonguing, we're slowing big intervals, we're not slowing big intervals. All these different contexts. That's how you develop. I know it sounds like I'm selling my book. I know it sounds like I'm selling the book, but that's what the book is for. That familiarity leads to that kind of accuracy. Normally, when we talk about accuracy, it really is in the context of cracking notes. So you go for the note and it splits. But like I said, if we think of it in terms of tolerance, like we do with machining, as you progress, and this is especially true with the classical stuff, as you become a better player, it's not good enough to not crack the note. That note has to be centered from the very beginning of the note. Centered with a pure sound from the very beginning of the note. So that's just a higher level of accuracy. Any other questions? We've got 2 minutes left. Any questions? If not, I'm going to tell you have a great weekend. Have a great week. I do have one of my students wants to take me fishing again, and that's always on Fridays. So we might miss in the next few weeks. We might miss a Friday while I'm out fishing. Gabriel says, "Thank you, Eddie. Great help from you all the time. Have a nice weekend. Goodbye, all friends." Yep. All right. Okay, I'm gonna count down from 20, and then if we don't get a question, we will go 10, 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now it's time to go. Thank you guys for hanging out. We will see you next time. God bless you and have a great weekend. Bye.